welcome to you, welcome to the audience to this first panel and to a really extraordinary combination of expertise. I'm very excited about this. It's typical of BDFI and putting together people who perhaps normally don't have the opportunity to be in the same conversation, but very much have shared interests. And I think although our panelists are all coming, as you'll see from the bios in your packs, they're coming from with different expertise and from different backgrounds, this is going to be a very, very important conversation. So the panel today is going to explore critical questions about digital futures. What questions do we have about digital futures? And then we're going to consider what approaches can we take to engaging with futures? And lastly, how might we move this forward in real practical next steps? That's the idea. Of course, we are going to have a conversation, so it could go in many other directions, but that's the agenda that our panelists have been working towards so far. I'll introduce each panelist as they come to present their initial 5-minute provocations on why they think digital futures are so critical now. Why do we need to think about socio-digital futures? And then once we've heard from each panelist, we'll move into that phase of discussion and we'll see where that takes us. So first up is my very great pleasure to welcome Charlie Warwick. Charlie has a history of industrial working on futures with a range of global companies. We just talked about this when we met. Charlie, I believe from Google to IKEA and many others in between you've been working with on future-facing strategies for those businesses. Charlie is now Head of Futures Advice for the UK Government Office for Science and works across government with a range of departments on foresight projects and programmes to develop futures thinking and more joined up human-centric and resilient policy and design. So perfect for us. Charlie, I'll pass to you for your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, and everybody. What a privilege to be here. Really cool to see some DCMS colleagues on the line. We're currently supporting you guys with your wireless infrastructure strategy development. So this feels like a really sort of apt and great moment to be involved in this conversation. So as Susan says, I am a futurist or a futures consultant. And really privileged to be alongside some perhaps more technical experts in the digital realm. But maybe I can open up this conversation or start this panel by looking backwards, if I may, Susan. Because throughout human history, this sort of intersection that's been mentioned between culture and technology has been really challenging territory. And as we've embraced and embedded different forms of non-human assistance, we actually have quite a terrible track record of imagining and managing that overlap, that sort of Venn diagram space between culture and technology, imagining the impacts of technology on culture and vice versa. And I just wanted to pick out a couple of examples from modern history. Firstly, I mean, industrialization in the UK, which promised incredible productivity gains in the 18th century. But as factories proliferated along riverbanks and in city centres, little thought was actually given to the impacts on citizen well-being. Air quality, water quality suffered, labour conditions were abysmal, particularly for children who were roped in and became integral to operations and maintenance. As we know, if anyone's read the poems of William Blake or any of the sort of contemporary social commentators of that time, there was this deplorable lack of foresight and consideration for the impacts of that huge technological shift on society. And 300 years later, we're actually still trying to undo some of the kind of water, air pollutant issues that were catalyzed by that period. Apparently, by the way, the Thames will be swimmable in about 8 years' time if this super sewer project works. So we'll see about that. So a little later than the Industrial Revolution, another example, developments in hydraulic mining technologies, they were the catalyst for the California gold rush of the 19th century. This time, you had mining communities springing up out of nowhere, huge amounts of migration, following the job opportunities and land grabs happening at pace, sniffing out the gold. But the formation of these communities without the necessary infrastructure or governance or regulation to make them healthy and safe places to live. And so you had famine and disease and essentially the wild, wild west ensuing. So there are parallels that we can draw between those periods of history and the transitional moment that we find ourselves in today. Except what's different and interesting about today is that we aren't looking at an intersectional space anymore between that human culture and non-human technologies. We're actually looking at a society bounded entirely by digital. So we're looking at concentric circles rather than a Venn diagram, if that makes sense to the visual thinkers in the virtual room. So our digital futures will look like individuals, organizations, communities, whole cultures wrapped in a layer of ambient intelligence, which will be entirely pervasive and influential, more so than any wave of innovation thus far. So you and I will experience this as we become more and more the center of our own personal digital ecosystem. And then the groups we live in and operate amongst will be both served and shaped in new ways, thanks to responsive sensing networks, entirely digitally enabled, wrapped in it. And on the grandest scale, access to and delivery of public services won't look the same either. So the impacts and the implications are vast, and a new and different context like that will necessitate a new social contract. So these are big questions. And on this question, this first question of why we need to be thinking about socio-digital futures, it's because we simply cannot plan or design or regulate for contexts that we haven't deliberately imagined. You wouldn't do a play without a dress rehearsal. Futures work is ultimately this process of rehearsal, of exploring possible futures, identifying collectively what would be a preferred future, and then mapping the systemic shift required to get there. The interventions we need to create to make those optimal conditions for a preferred future, which as a species we've more often than not failed to do. And finally, from me, why plug socio-digital together? Because we need to avoid some of those technocratic governance blunders of the past. We need a more balanced, holistic, and diverse representation and voices when it comes to imagining that range of futures that Susan was talking about, and in identifying that preferred future that works for the benefit of everyone. But I'll stop there for now, and I do look forward to digging into how we might actually do this, but I'll hand back to the panel.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Lots of food for thought there, but we won't pause now. We'll move directly on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Alex Taylor, who also has an interesting and varied history of working across academic and industrial research, including with Xerox and Microsoft, and is now a reader in human-computer interaction at City University. So over to you, Alex, for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Susan. Like Charlie, it's such a pleasure to be invited to be on the panel, and I've admired Susan's work from afar for a long time, so it's been nice to have a chance to chat with her. So I've been thinking about that question of why socio-digital futures, and in the sort of notes that I was sketching out for myself, I sort of put elephant in the room, thinking that I'd be the first one to sort of catch the tensions between culture and technology, but Charlie's beaten me to it, so there's no longer an elephant in the room here. I guess the way I want to come at it, though, is to think about that idea of the socio-technical, and that to me that presents or represents the troubled entanglements between the social and technical worlds that I think many of us find ourselves inhabiting in everyday life, but certainly those of us who are academics live that very vividly. And I feel like I've really encountered that through my own professional career. As Susan said, I've worked in corporate industry for much of my career, probably 15 years or so, for Xerox. where many of the inventions that we now use today had their seeds sown. Then Microsoft for 13 years, and I'm currently working part-time with Google. So many of you are probably going to ask me questions about my ethics there, but maybe we can talk about that in a bit. And also I operate in I do work in a field, HCI, human-computer interaction, that really feels like it epitomizes those tensions between the socio and technical. And so I think that question of why socio-digital futures is really about, for me, why socio-digital. That's kind of the tension here that we operate in. And I think the trouble is that the tensions are everywhere, right down to how we understand scholarly academic work. And so, just to give you a list, we speak different languages, we approach and study worlds in seemingly incommensurate ways. We have fundamentally different ways of thinking about answers and solutions. And some of my work is really thinking about solutionism in technology and the presumptions that we are solving problems, discrete problems. And then as scholars, we measure ourselves against very different outcomes and achievements. And so some of my work has been involved with academics and machine learning and AI, and it becomes really hard to work with academics in those fields because their outputs are measured in very different ways to my own as someone working in social sciences and human-computer interaction. And so, if you like, these tensions pervade our work. They come manifest themselves in a way that, if you like, is a wall, or we might think of as a wall that separates the social and the digital, and that separates the way in which we progress our imaginations about what the future might be. What I want to say today is that I think there's a different way of thinking about the socio-digital. And I know these are ideas that Susan's written about a great deal and spoken about, and that others in the audience have also thought about. And I'm particularly thinking about Becky Coleman, who I know is on the call and also part of the Bristol Digital Futures Institute. And so it's not a new idea, but I think rather than a wall, I think we can be thinking in terms of potentiality. So what do those tensions enable? So always, of course, and I think Susan alluded to this in the opening to today's events, there are concerns that might come with these tensions, but there's also a potential, what I would call a generative potential, and in particular, generative potential to tell stories about different worlds and unexpected futures. And it's that kind of the possibility and potentiality for something we might not be able to imagine now that's really important to me. And I think that's where, people coming together from the social and digital really have the potential to think differently. And that's what really excites me about what's happening at Bristol, the University of Bristol at the moment. So by stories here, I really want to think about how we need to be creating the conditions, not for what we know will happen. So like the usual disciplinary disagreements that we all have, well, many of us are very familiar with, but for what might just happen. And it's that idea of, again, potentiality, the possibility of something else that really kind of drives my own research. And so we might begin to imagine, as Charlie was alluding to, fairer and more just ways of living together, ways of living and dying that sustain us and sustain our environments, and futures that make us more than what we are. And that idea of being more than who we are is really key to me. And I don't just mean that individually, I mean that collectively. And my own work has been sort of thinking about that space of potentiality and being more than who we are. So as I said, just in closing, I'm really excited about what Bristol Digital Futures is doing in this space, because I think it really is creating the conditions for these kinds of stories. And so I want to kind of position, if you like, walls against stories that, we might by default think about walls, but I think what we have the opportunity here to do is think about other kinds of stories. And so the Bristol Digital Futures Institute, for example, talks of a commitment to socio-digital co-productions. And so the idea of co-producing news stories, to me, is critical to these new futures. I'd like to leave it there. I have other things to say that hopefully we'll come to later on.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think that's going to segue probably quite nicely into our next speaker. It is my very great pleasure to welcome today Kwame Ava Feukeu, who is working in UNESCO as an anticipation specialist, so very much around some of the politics and methodologies for thinking about futures and working in a co-produced and collaborative way, and is the Africa coordinator for the Futures Literacy Programme at UNESCO. Welcome, Ava, and over to you for your 5 minutes.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and I'm very glad to be here. So thanks for having me. I would actually continue on Alex's provocation on a particular issue when it comes to digital futures. Usually when we think about digital futures, there's an association that we make quite naturally with the notion of inclusion. This idea that digital futures go hand in hand with inclusive futures. And I've always found it to be quite interesting in this idea that basically if we go to another location, to another space, here the virtual space, we would find ourselves to become more equal, more free, better beings. I don't know if it rings a bell, maybe thinking about the colonization of Mars and this idea that having failed the Earth, we are entitled to find our Eden or find our paradise elsewhere without transforming ourselves. So space would change, but we as humans would not. Time would pass, but we as humans would not. So we're currently using the future to become either eternal fossils or better parasites. I don't know which metaphor is better for you, but you do see an issue that we've been encountering, which is what does it take for us to accept to change together with the passing of time? What does it mean for us to work together in light of our differences? And sometimes we even say, despite our differences, which does give you some time of the paradigm that we actually use when we think about the future. And so the work that I do around the future for me comes from that premise that we first need to start from our ability to appreciate difference. Now, the issue that we have is that we've inherited from the 19th century a strong image of the future that is founded on the notion or the concept of universality. Being one meant being the same, no matter the cost. And this legacy has remained on a systematic, like a series of choices that we made around expanding youth, about producing tools, industrial tools that enable different societies all around the world to actually become a little bit more of the same. And it remained also because we have forgotten the colonial roots of that reasoning. I like to believe that the pandemic has actually enabled more people, has enlarged the amount of people who have come to realize something that some of us had realized right at the middle of the 20th century. The fact that we've basically facing the challenge of the failure of universality. What does it mean to go beyond the one-size-fits-all type of approach in the way we design products, in the way we design education systems? And you see that some of the issues that we have when it comes to producing tools are the very same issues that we meet in the production of social and human sciences. It comes from this arrogance of knowing a solution that is supposed to work for humankind as a whole. So we are asked to actually revisit our premises. And that starts by questioning why we use the future, how we use the future. And all of this is connected to a matter of perception and what we have been taught to perceive, what we have been taught to believe to be worthy of perception in the future and actually in the present. Now, our greatest realization amongst the community of futurists or anticipation specialists, you name it the way you feel most comfortable, is actually the need to think beyond tools. and to structure our focus on competencies. The need to move beyond building scenarios that were not meant to happen anyway, or even if those scenarios were actually to come to be, we realized that those scenarios would be focused on what matters to us today and not to generations tomorrow. So the advantage of a capability-based approach to futures for well-being, what we call futures literacy, is actually the ability to think and act with complexity and embrace transdisciplinarity, not just for the fun of it, but also because we come to realize that connecting different forms and different sources of knowledge is our only way forward, but also our only way backwards in order to interpret the past and the present. So I look very much forward to explaining a little bit more what we do at UNESCO around expanding future literacy. How do we apply that to different themes? But I'll pause it here to actually allow our last panelist to also go ahead.
Thank you very, very much, Ava. Starting to see some really strong lines of discussion across the panel. My great pleasure to introduce our final panelist, Dr. John Manley. John Manley, like the other panelists, also has a very diverse history, very relevant to the panel. Long history at Hewlett-Packard's European Research Laboratories. Unlike anybody else on the panel, was High Sheriff of the County of City of Bristol from 2020, a one-year royal appointment, and is now, since that time, founded Asking Bristol, which is a very interesting practical innovation in the city, which I think he might be going to tell us a little bit more about, if not in his 5 minutes, certainly when we can move to the panel. Over to you, John, for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I'm also delighted to be here at the launch of what I know will be a fantastic institute answering some fundamental questions about technology and society. For the next 5 minutes, I'm going to say several things without expansion, but I'll be very happy to expand later or subsequently. And I'm going to focus on internet-based systems, as I believe that connectivity is at the heart of the challenge here. And I've long been fascinated by four tensions in internet systems: visible versus invisible, centralized versus decentralized, top-down versus bottom-up, and virtual versus physical. Systems and solutions lie throughout this four-dimensional space. And this institute will make choices, and these choices will impact how it enables inclusive, prosperous, and sustainable societies. If I had to make a choice, I would lean towards more invisible, more decentralized, more bottom-up, and more physical. So why? So although the internet enables the creation of vast global scale players that control global scale entities, it is fundamentally decentralized. It also enables communities of a human scale to form, to thrive, and be creative. The digital future for this institute is the enablement of communities on a human scale at the edge of the internet, and then to interconnect them to create larger and larger social structures on a city, region, country, and global scale. The place to start in building social structures and societies is from the bottom up, something that the internet is uniquely able to do and support. 20 years ago, the talk was of the death of distance. The internet and communications technologies had made geographical distance irrelevant in human contact and doing business. The intervening 20 years have made it even more so. We can now all choose to be part of a global community and behave as if we're in the same room as today. However, the recent lockdowns have reminded us of something forgotten. Although we are now in virtual Zoom communities having gin tasting tutorials with friends worldwide, we're also part of physical communities centered on the half mile from our home. People rediscovered their local fruit and veg shop and found that their neighbors were interesting and kind people they'd wished they'd spoken to more. They helped elderly neighbors with their shopping and helped a young person with their chemistry homework. This is the true death of distance. We realized that strengthening physical communities benefited everyone. So how can this institute deepen and accelerate the formation of such local communities and connect them into ever larger and larger communities? It's a bottom-up approach, one that celebrates diversity. A top-down approach celebrates uniformity. So last year as High Sheriff of Bristol, I tried to meet as many of the communities in the city of Bristol, it's a tiny county with a population of 480,000 people, that I could in 1 year. We have about 90 villages, so these are location-based communities. And in addition, there are all the non-location-based communities. We have over 100 language communities, 20 faith communities, art, sport, conservation, older people, and so on. So there's at least 300 distinguishable communities within the city. Could we enhance the connectivity of the city through the third sector? In all, there are over 3,000 charities and voluntary community groups. Asking Bristol has the ambition to democratise asking, giving and connecting for these 3,000 plus groups, enabling the very smallest with 2 part-time volunteers to be treated exactly the same as the largest with an income of £40 million. Bristol is a super connected city. The degree of separation here appears to be 1 or 2. Democratisation means using this super connectivity to connect every charity, voluntary group with the very best individuals, organisations, businesses in the city to match their asks for time, space, things or services. If the super connectivity of Bristol is represented in the plain, then the connections between, for example, Children's Scrap Store in St Werburgh's and DHL in Severn Beach, who offer them warehousing space, is a line that passes through the plain and it is in the third dimension. Asking Bristol with tens of thousands of asks a year would turn Bristol from a 2D super connected city into a 3D hyper connected city, the first in the world. The resulting impact on social connectivity, social cohesion and equality would be significant. This is a true digital future of connected communities, hyper-connected cities and regions and plesio-connected countries, achieved through deploying and mimicking internet systems that are more invisible, more decentralized, more bottom-up and more physical. Thank you.
John, and thank you all of you. I think we could probably have a conversation for days, for 20 minutes, which is actually what we have left. But the purpose of the symposium is to start provoking ideas, to start conversations, to make networks and links between people, both on the panel and with our wider audience. And I'm sure that we're doing that just by the 4 presentations that we've had already. In the 20 minutes we've got left, I've got 2 questions really that I'd like the panel to consider, although, you know, if you have questions for each other and things that you would like to raise that fall outside of that, please do. This doesn't have to be a highly curated conversation. I think I'll pose both the questions together at first so that we know kind of what the agenda is for the next 20 minutes, and then maybe it'll be a more free-ranging conversation. So the first question relates to this issue of futures. And I think for some people talking about futures can seem quite trivial and can seem as though why would we be thinking about futures in the context of some of the very pressing and real challenges of the present, particularly when we think about the political economy of the digital. And I welcome all of you to say something about that, to why, if and why you think futures, well, why, I guess, because we know you do think futures are an important focus, why you think that's important, and particularly how it relates perhaps to those questions of inequality and power in the digital age. There are no easy answers to this. I'd just be interested to hear your take on it. The second part of that would be how do we engage with futures? You know, as I said in the introduction, and I know all of you agree, the future isn't something we can simply predict and fix. The future is more complex, or futures are more complex than that. So what kinds of skills and expertise do we need to engage with that? And then the second big question is what are the practical implications of all that then? You know, this is a nice conversation, it's interesting, it's thought-provoking, but what do we do practically? This picks up on some of the points that John has raised about connecting that thinking into practical action. So would anybody like to go first with why futures? Why is it important to think about futures in the current moment?
I don't mind kicking off.
Thank you,
That's okay. I would love to hear from fellow panelists. I mean, futures as a sort of field was only really born in the 60s. It's still a very nascent, nebulous kind of experimenting space. So I don't think, firstly, anyone should be kind of afraid of, I don't know, corrupting any kind of methodology or doing it wrong. Actually, just having this kind of conversation and opening up the potential for futures thinking is a good start. Without getting into some of the methodologies and tools, and I know Ava very aptly said, this is more about capability and mindset. And so I would say that there are maybe 3 or 4 general kind of principles for people who are wanting to go out and have more future-facing conversations, more inclusive conversations. Firstly, bear in mind that when you're doing any kind of futures work, you're working at the edge of knowledge, meaning that we can know everything and anything about what's past and what's present, but we can't know what's future. So the act of doing futures is about translating insight, gathering a lot of intelligence about different kinds and types of change, you know, demographic, technological, economic, political, environmental, and then connecting the dots in imaginative ways, taking that imaginative leap to consider what's possible when those things start to interact and impact on one another. So principles really here are, do take time to see the bigger picture, to consider a wider range of changes that you see. And people do have, I think, the tendency to overprivilege technological change and perhaps underprivilege values shifts, you know, socioeconomic or sociocultural change, before then kind of doing that translation exercise into imagining different futures. And as you're kind of engaging with that process, I would say, as others have said before me, this work is best done with a diversity of perspectives that is ideally reflective of the society that has a stake in the outcome. I think Asking Bristol is a fantastic example of this kind of engagement. And as you're inviting a diversity of perspectives, also invite dissent and disruption, because as Alex said earlier, there's a range of possible or plausible futures. Some are actually perhaps less plausible and even less palatable than others, but they're still possible. So encouraging people around you to think about disruption, to think about wildcard events or phenomena, things that we really don't want to talk about, but should be reflected in our representation of the future. That's really important. So yeah, just general principles, taking a wider angle view of change, inviting a diversity of perspectives, embracing dissent and disruption. And finally, you know, the practical kind of recommendation here is to create the space and the situations and the facilitators to enable, or kind of explicitly enable, this kind of thinking. It's what we're trying to do in government. It's obviously what folks on this panel are trying to do too. I would just finally say I love this idea of the BDFI emulator. I think etymologically that's so interesting, because it's an emulator, not a simulator. If we try to evoke empathy rather than sympathy, if we really try to bring futures to life so you can empathize with your future self or others in those futures, that will mobilize and galvanize action far, far better than sympathy. So I just wanted to say I really like that emulator tag. But I will stop there and let others react.
Thanks, Charlie. I wonder, Ava, if we should come to you to hear a little bit more about why futures are so important to the work of UNESCO and the work that you do, and the methods, perhaps, how you engage futures, because I think your approach to capabilities is particularly strong and well developed.
Thank you. I actually will follow up on what Charlie has said, already laying out different design principles, because usually when people come to us, of how do we do it, but they're looking for, you know, a how-to manual, or basically you follow the steps and then you've done it right, so you tick all of the boxes. And as Charlie reminded us just earlier, the power and the beauty of futures, but that's also something that reveals our fragility, is the fact that when you come, you know, to a historic class, if we ask you what happened in 1792, you know, there's at least one person who knows, you know, and if it's not you, well, there's Wikipedia. Now, when it comes to what happens in 2092, well, the good thing is nobody knows, which is a way to actually enable people to create, to imagine, but also to gather knowledge that comes from within. With this idea that it's not about discovery, but actually about exploration. And the implication that it has, or things around iterative knowledge, iterative processes, it's about experimentation, of course, but it's also about the positionality that we have as researchers. And what's interesting is that we've been developing what we call action research processes that are actually built on this idea that researchers are not the ones who are the only owners of knowledge, which speaks to an issue that I think is central to futures, which is the notion of power. There's an expression that I really love because I think it translates a lot of things that actually are crucial when it comes to futures, which is this idea that when it comes to possible futures and more specifically probable futures, those have less to do with reality than with what we have been taught to think as acceptable. So what we think is a probable future for tomorrow may be about the future of our climate response, the future of AI ethics, or the future of medicine as a whole, has less to do with what's going to happen, like in terms of what is realistic, and a lot more to do with, there are acceptable futures and unacceptable futures. And when you hear ideas that you find to be crazy, ask yourself, is it crazy just because, you know, it comes from a mad person, or is it crazy because it actually challenges the establishment or what we've been taught to believe? And in that sense, what we've been developing in terms of tools and techniques is what we call future literacy processes that, as I said earlier, or action research processes that are built in this idea of provocation, because we believe that the future already put us in some forms of equal footing. That's something that can be, you know, debatable. And I would hear some of the arguments that would have about, does the future actually put us on an equal footing? But let's say that you have people that are all around the table. They come because they actually are passionate about an issue. So if it's about the future of animal health, they come together because they care about animal health, which is actually the starting point for that conversation to be had. Starting from there, they put on the table the futures that they know, probable futures, preferred futures. All of those actually speaks to what they know of the present. It's less to do with the future, actually, and a lot to do with their present. Same way we get all of many ideas around the pandemic today in ways that 2 years ago, I didn't get to hear that many pandemic scenarios, but you get them in a first phase. Then we actually encourage them to explore some type of provocation, very much related to what we call in educational sciences, this idea of experiential learning. So provocation as a way for people to learn. Following those processes, we see that futures were in fact spaces for people to learn, spaces for people to discuss, spaces for people to negotiate meaning of a particular topic that was identified beforehand by a small community of people who just wanted for people to talk. Now, the question is, what can we learn from the future? Which is a way for us to actually set a series of priorities for ourselves to actually identify what we want to do together. And so for us, that has been some of the techniques that we've been exploring in order for people to actually develop what we call their futures literacy.
Thanks very much, Ava. We'd love to talk some more about that, I think, but not today, given the pressing time that we have. Maybe we can take it forward into the final question, because we just have 8 minutes left. So the final question about what that means in practical terms, in terms of talking about building capacity and then its capacity to do, capacity to act and to be agentic. What kinds of capacities and practical next steps, Alex and John, I'd like to come to you. Do you think the futures thinking and the futures methods and the starting with this really direct focus on the future as a kind of object of inquiry and a methodology of practice, what are the practical advantages and next steps that we might build on that from your perspective. John has a little bit, and maybe could say some more about asking Bristol. Alex, I don't know if you want to think about that in relation to your work with Google and some of the ethics work that you've been doing on global labour markets. Happy, whoever would like to go first. I wish we were in the same room, it would be so much easier.
Go ahead, John.
So the social world and the IT or the technical, the digital world are symbiotic. And the social world comes with challenges and needs. And the digital world can try to provide some solutions. It's not as one-sided as that, because the demands of enormously complex social structures can themselves force developments in technology. Now, the thing is that the social world and the societies evolve, and the challenges and the needs evolve, which means that continually we need to evolve the technological solutions that provide partial solutions to them. The real difference is those in the IT world are used to disruptions. If we look back over the last 40 years, the trajectory of the technology world has got enormous jumps and discontinuities in it. But I think that the social and societal worlds haven't experienced such forms of disruption. And that's very interesting with asking Bristol, which is centered in the third sector, which of course is a vitally important and huge part of social structures. If you look at it, there's been very little in the way of disruption to the third sector that I can see over decades. And the question is whether the mindset of disruptions that comes from the IT world could start to be applied in the social world as well. That it's not, we shouldn't be looking at gradual evolutions, we should be looking at disruptive evolutions.
I mean, thank you. And that's a really interesting topic for debate in terms of, you know, your provocation that the social world has not been disrupted in the way that the technical world has. And I think some people might come back at that in terms of some of the changes that we've seen over the past 50 years or so in relation to gender, or in relation to global mobility, or in relation to inequality, for example. But certainly, I think it's important to think about the kind of different modes of disruption and the different ways we have of thinking and talking about disruption in the social world compared with in the IT world, as you named it, John. And I think what I'm hearing from everybody is that we need better ways of, better language and more joined up conversations about understanding those disruptions and the relationships between them, actually, because it's very common, as you said at the beginning of your response, to say that it's the IT that causes the change. But then you came back and you said that also all the IT impacts on society, but you came back and you said, but of course the organisation, political, economic, social organisation of society is profoundly driving the creation of digital technologies, which are largely done within a particular economic model and by certain demographics of innovators and entrepreneurs. So it's that iterative and co-produced, actually, if I can repurpose that word from a different context, the co-produced nature of the social and the technical that I think all of you are talking about. And then we have temporality, you know, pasts, presents and futures, and how we think. Charlie's thinking about pasts and those illustrative parallels that you raised, Charlie, from previous rounds. And I think it's often very tempting when we look at the past to say, oh, well, that was the past, and okay, yes, we can see now that we got that wrong, but not to worry, we'll get the future right. And I think it's really important to say, hang on, don't be quite so arrogant, as I'm saying to myself here. You know, of course, we need to be more reflexive about that. We can learn from the past, but that won't mean we can fix the future, for sure. So I think that's something that we're taking from this. The question of disruption is absolutely central to BDFI. you know, that there is all sorts of interest in disruptive technologies and creating disruptive technologies, but doing that in a way that understands and engages with the processes of social disruption and also the risks of disruption, because, you know, it's not always a question that technologies are going to fix problems, but they may well also create a range of problems, as Charlie again alluded to, in terms of the roots of the climate change crisis, which you know, nobody was thinking about when the internal combustion engine was invented and then so rapidly became part of change around the world through the Industrial Revolution. But of course, that's what, you know, those futures were already in the making as we saw that rapid growth of industrialization, and continue to be in the making as that spreads through other parts of the world. We have 2 minutes left. Alex, I wanted to give you an opportunity to come back on anything that you'd like to come back to in the final 2 minutes, but no pressure.
Oh, 2 minutes, gosh. I really love the thread of conversation that's evolving, and as you said, Susan, we could be talking for the day. I think one of the things that you said in the earlier introduction was how we're always involved in making futures, whether we intend to or not. And I think you know, that's why I think it's incumbent on us now to be thinking about futures, because of course we're living in a time in which we're increasingly aware of the unfairnesses, injustices, and damage that we're doing to our environments. And I think, you know, picking up on the thread, and particularly what Eva's said, which is really kind of right at the heart of things for me, is this kind of idea of the arrogance of those so often who yield the power and make decisions, and the presumptions around, you know, a status quo of knowing and doing in the world that deserves disruption. It demands disruption. And I think for me, you know, I find that a really difficult space to work in when I'm working for, you know, these big tech companies who are very much the kind of the people who yield this sort of power. And so I guess to very briefly answer one of the direct questions you asked me, Susan, is, you know, how do we rethink those kind of, those paths and those presents that we are working along to imagine different futures? How do we, so for example, the technologies that are involved in developing AI, of course, involve a whole chain of actors and laborers, and that these bodies and agents are distributed across the planet. And yet, of course, we only hear about the kind of adventures in Silicon Valley, and not these other actors who are involved. And so much of my work at Google and other what research that I do is about recentering agency and recentering those sorts of people who are involved in making these technologies that we, you know, surround us now, and particularly sort of putting an emphasis on the work in the global South. I could talk for hours about that. I know we're at time.
Yes, we could. Thank you, Alex. I don't know what happened to Charlie. She disappeared. I hope she's all right. Thanks to Charlie. Thanks also to you, Ava, to Alex and John. We have just begun the conversation. I'm so grateful to you for your time. I'm so grateful to you for your patience and willingness to join a panel full of quite diverse voices and quite diverse people. And I really look forward to continuing this relationship and these conversations with BDFI in the future. Thank you.